Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to those online as well. Je suis extrêmement heureux de vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour cette nouvelle conférence hybride de CLPS. I'm super delighted to have a terrific panel with us today. My name is Marina Pavlovich. I'm one of the interim directors of the Center for Law, Technology, and Society. I would also like to acknowledge that the University of Ottawa is located on the unceded, unsurrendered, ancestral home of the Anishinaabe people. I would also like to acknowledge and thank many Indigenous nations across Canada and the world who have been the stewards of the land, water, and air of their territories that are being used to transmit wireless signals today. I am going to turn it over to my colleague Vivek Krishnamurthy to introduce our terrific panel and just take it away.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marina. Welcome, everyone. So glad to see so many of you here in person. I was just thinking that this is my first in-person CLTS event since 2019, which is fantastic. But we are hybrid as well, because that's a great way of doing things in this day and age. So I'm Vivek Krishnamurthy. I teach here at the Faculty of Law. Really excited to be moderating this panel today on ArriveCAN. And I'm curious, just before we get any further, how many people in the room have actually used ArriveCAN? So practically everyone has had some first-person experience with this, and that's great. I think I'll make for a great discussion. So we're here to talk about ArriveCAN, which of course is the app that the government of Canada introduced back in the fall of 2020 to help travelers comply with COVID restrictions. It became mandatory later in 2020, and seemed to be something that like income tax was going to be temporary yet permanent until it was ArriveCAN in October. Hence the name of the panel, when the government had a change of heart. So today we're going to explore the circumstances that led to the introduction of this system and some of the many issues that a system like ArriveCAN raises around mobility rights, data collection, and other kinds of issues, all with the intersection of public health. And I think it's this is where I'm going to use some of my speaker role to talk about the trend that we have seen over the years of many countries trying to push the border out so that you're not just at the point of entry into the country for the first time meeting its government, but doing something beforehand with electronic information being sent by airlines to app-based collection. So thinking about this larger trend and its implications on privacy and other rights. Now I'm going to introduce our panelists today in the order in which they're going to be presenting. So seated to my far left is David Murakami Wood, who is an interdisciplinary specialist in surveillance, security, and technology in cities, and works on these issues from a global perspective. He is a full professor in our Department of Criminology here at the University of Ottawa and a member of our Center for Law, Technology, and Society. I'm very pleased that David has made the move from Kingston to Ottawa, where he was previously a professor at Queen's University. David is a co-editor of the journal Surveillance Study, a reader, and Big Data and Surveillance and Security Intelligence, which is out from the UBC Press, and a forthcoming handbook of critical surveillance studies, which sounds absolutely fantastic and really interesting. And David, we're glad to have you here. Next, seated just to my left, is Bianca Wylie, who's a writer and open government and public technology advocate based in Toronto with a dual background in technology and public engagement. She's a partner at Digital Public and the co-founder of Tech Reset Canada. Got to say that I'm happy that you were able to fly in today because the weather has deteriorated a lot since this morning. So Bianca worked for many years in the tech sector in operations, infrastructure, corporate training, and product management. And more recently has been a professional facilitator supporting public consultation processes for governments and government agencies. She founded the Open Data Institute in Toronto, which operated from 2019 rather, and co-founded Civic Tech Toronto in 2015. To my right, and this is actually our speaking order, so this is perfect, is Ciara Bracken-Roche, who is an assistant professor at the Maynooth University School of Law and Criminology in Ireland, and is here with us as an adjunct professor of criminology at the University of Ottawa. Dr. Bracken-Roche's work has focused primarily on the impacts of surveillance and surveillance technologies on civil liberties, human rights, and privacy. She has a broad range of research experience both in Canada and in Ireland, including some time that she spent with our Office of the Privacy Commissioner here in Canada. Her empirical work has focused on drone technologies, borders, and facial recognition, and also on privacy advocacy for people with convictions. And I also love the fact that some of your current work you're doing with, I guess, the Garda in Ireland is around, that's the National Police of Ireland, if I'm not mistaken, is on the use of facial recognition and drones. And you have to wonder what could possibly go wrong with either of those technologies. All right, so we're gonna have each of our panelists speak for about 15 minutes. And then, following a little bit of discussion amongst us, open it up to you for your questions and comments. So, David, really, really happy to invite you to kick us off.
Thanks very much. Okay, that seems to be working. I want to start, before I get into my remarks, on a sad note in a way. What I'm going to say today is in memory of Ilya Zurich, who was one of the founding members of the Surveillance Studies Center at Queen's University, and one of the really founding scholars in surveillance studies altogether. Unfortunately, we learned of his death yesterday. He was a man who leapt over borders. He came to the USA from the Middle East, where his ancestry in Palestine had been obviously completely destroyed by the colonial activities of Israel. And then he had to escape again from the USA when they tried to draft him for the Vietnam War, and came to Canada, which is much to our benefit, of course. Ilya was a humane, dedicated scholar, and he would have loved to have been here tonight. So thank you, Ilya. Now, we've heard already what ArriveCAN is. It's not complicated in some ways, right? It's a very small, simple little piece of software. But I'm sure we'll hear from Bianca and Ciara that that's far from the whole truth. Small, simple things are rarely what they seem to be. What I'm going to do before we get into that is to think about some of the background to where we are with ArriveCAN. And I think we need to step back first because we need to understand that this is not just about one app and one particular measure taken at one particular occasion. As Vivek reminded us at the beginning, this is about a very long-term trend towards the transformation of the border from a relatively simple edge of a nation state into something that becomes a condition of being, a zone, something that is flexible, or as Homi Bhabha famously said, is everywhere. And I want to highlight here, first of all, the crucial role of globalization. We saw huge increases in trade, air passenger volumes during the second half of the 20th century. Absolutely massive numbers. And of course, this increased, as far as nation states were concerned, the flow of risks. And by risks here, we're thinking about things like organized crime, terrorism, of course, but also rather more diffuse and nebulous things like disease. And we all know what happens in that context. Environmental damage. And of course, air travel, particularly as a carrier of, if you like, the global environmental crisis in many ways, something that's intimately involved in those kinds of things. Never mind all the other things that go along with air travel, like wildlife crime and trafficking and all of those things. So there's been, during this period, a concomitant and connected globalization of security that's grown with the growth of international passenger transport and international trade. And this has been driven, of course, by our old friends, the United States, and particularly the US in conjunction with its Five Eyes partners, of which Canada, of course, is one. And I say partners, and we all know that's bullshit, right? Sorry. We all know that this is not a partnership. The US, of course, sets the terms, the US sets the rules, the US gets the information, and Canada gets whatever the US decides that Canada should have in return. I mean, often that's it's a very equal relationship, but often it isn't. Let's not stop there, though, because it's not just about the Five Eyes. Everyone always thinks it's about the Five Eyes, but the behind-the-scenes discussions that go on at the G7, G8, and G20 summits the OECD, other international organizations like this, not in the headline ways, but often in secret sessions, are what often drives these kind of security considerations and changes. And when you see things like ArriveCAN or like changes to other forms of inspection, surveillance at the border, many occasions they've already been discussed, not in Canadian government necessarily, but in these international fora, these backroom discussions at the G8, for example, the G7 as it is at the moment. Of course, there's a big question, even for nation states here, and that's what's the balance? And this is not a question I like to ask, by the way, because balances between security and liberty are always dangerous questions, but these are the kinds of questions that nation states are asking. Does, for example, as Paul Cellucci, the former US ambassador to Canada, famously said, you know, security trumps trade, which was in some ways a really quite startling thing to say in our age of neoliberal globalization. Does it really? Is there really actually trade-offs that way as well as with privacy and security? There are different answers that people come up with to this. So what's really going on here? I think we've got to step back, first of all, to 9/11. And I'm really sorry to go back there again for those of us who are older and actually remember 9/11. It's like we're always going back to 9/11, like people always used to go back to the end of the Cold War. But it's really important. And what happened post 9/11 probably is far more important to understanding ArriveCAN than probably even COVID is. That's a very controversial statement, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Because what happened post 9/11 was the upgrading on a massive scale of security and the intensification of surveillance, which was not a contingent response to a perceived crisis, not just that. This was actually a rational expansion of already existing measures, practices, and processes, as David Lyon said in 2006. In other words, a lot of that stuff, particularly the technology, was already there, waiting to be introduced. And what needed to happen was something, and this is not a conspiracy theory, by the way, because it could have been anything. Something needed to happen for all those corporations with their new technologies to move from being beyond the pale, something we would never do, like we would never go there, to being something that was actually the answer to a question that we'd never asked. So, I mean, famously, of course, one of the major biometrics industry spokespeople in the USA after 9/11 said, this is what we've been waiting for. He didn't mean the deaths of 3,000 people, of course. He meant the opportunity to sell, you know, biometric technologies. No one wanted this before. No one wanted facial recognition or iris recognition or all of these different things. This was weird and creepy, and we didn't like it. But after 9/11, suddenly it's like, we've got to stop the terrorists. We'll do anything. And you've got to see these things happening again and again and again in bigger and smaller ways. So the same is true with COVID and post-COVID. So it's easy to see that ArriveCAN as purely a reaction to COVID, which then grew and crept out beyond its original intentions. But actually, I would say it's, in the long term, it's better to see it as a part of a punctuated long-term process in a surveillance society and in security states. Because if you step back and look at what we might call advanced border controls, or ABCs, as some people call them, you can go back to the 1950s and look at early attempts to create certain kinds of border control measures. You can look at pre-clearance systems, information systems for passengers, border kiosks. All of these things have a long history. The Canada Pre-Clearance Act was 1999, not during COVID, not after 9/11, right? These things were happening before in various ways. Pilot programs for APIS, for the Advanced Passenger Information System, took place in 1988. Again, not post 9/11 even, a long time before. And there were concept developments for border kiosks, automated kiosks and so on in the 1980s. Right, so this stuff has been there, whether it's the technology or the policy. Now, up to a point, and up to a certain point in time, these kinds of security changes have been supported by the airline industry. In many ways, the airline industry saw these as part of a program of efficiency, of actually making their operations more effective, more efficient, and, you know, creating lower handling costs and corporate advantages in air traffic. However, this began to change after 9/11. I think this is when security started to trump trade, well, security also started to trump passenger rights. And the airlines did not like that as much as they had liked the changes up to that point. So what happened after 9/11 was the border started to be pushed out. First of all, we've mentioned that previously before. So we see border control starting to become something that begins way beyond the border. It begins in consulates in other countries. It begins in pre-clearance programs. And of course, I really want to emphasize this here. Whatever we think about the privacy problems and the inconveniences to the majority white travelers in airports, the people who really suffer from these kinds of systems are people who are looking for refuge, are people who are migrating, people of color, people that don't have the same advantages around the world. And we've got to remember the vast majority of people who suffer most through these things are those kinds of people, and not those of us who are inconvenienced in a minor way or who feel that our privacy has been infringed on in a small way in the airport. I think we've always got to bear that in mind. Whatever you think about our privacy, that's not the biggest problem here. It's global social justice, global data justice. The other aspects of things that are changed post 9/11, just briefly, were expanded border intelligence systems. So this is where the Five Eyes come in, and we get intelligence sharing networks created on visa applications. These start to become routine, whereas before they'd been unusual, like specific searches, they start to become routine. I should say, by the way, it doesn't mean these things are seamless now. You can pretty easily, go through various different airports and with various different airlines, and stuff will not be joined up. I know for a fact, for example, passport systems, national passport systems are not at all joined up. How do I know this? Well, you may notice my name is Murakami Wood. My partner is Japanese. Japanese people are not allowed to have dual nationality. And yet many of them have several passports. How do they do this? Because nobody knows, right? The Japanese government has no way of checking that you have another passport or you're using it elsewhere. Those systems are not joined up. So we've got to remember this is a process. It's not a complete process at all. However scary it might seem in some ways, we're way, way away from some kind of global integrated system of passport control, pre-clearance and everything else. Border management, of course, very important. And that changes the ways in which we technologically and in processual ways access the border itself. We're all familiar with this now, all these automated systems. I know going to London now, you barely see a person going through Heathrow. It's actually quite creepy. It's really, really strange. And of course, if you do see a person, you're in trouble, basically. That's when you know something's going to happen. And then, of course, heavy investments in enforcement. We never see this stuff, right? Again, if you're going through the airport as an ordinary person, a normal person in the Foucauldian sense, you don't see this enforcement, right? But behind the scenes, there are the men with batons. There are the systems of, enhanced interrogation. There are all these other kinds of things that are there. You hopefully, and I really hope you never experience any of these things. Just occasionally, some of us do. Don't make a joke ever about hiding stuff in places you don't want to be searched in. That's all I can say. Never, never make a joke about that. You won't forget it. So that kind of process is something that is ArriveCAN is part of, but is not the end point of. And I think that's the final point I want to make here at this stage, is that ArriveCAN embodies certain aspects of these trends in the context of COVID and post-COVID. But it's not like some ultimate goal. Some people have been treating this like it's some program the government has, some secret, well, a lot of the right wing particularly, some secret program to control us all. It's not that level of program or policy. But it is important as part of this long-term and punctuated process towards increased and intensified border controls. Okay, I'll pass this on next to Bianca Wylie. I think I'll pass you the microphone as well.
So how I ran into ArriveCAN was actually friends and family. We asked the question about ArriveCAN. I'm not going to ask about COVID Alert, but do people remember COVID Alert? The app that you were supposed to download and it would notify. So there's so many issues with ArriveCAN, but coming off of understanding that COVID alert was junk science, basically, and was not going to work, and people knew that from the very beginning prior to it being launched. It was finally retired. And then I remember sort of like walking out of that haze. And then a family member called me and they were like, what's this thing I have to use at the airport? I was like, I don't know. What is this thing you have to use at the airport? And then a friend of mine called me probably within a week with the same question. They said, I had to use a thing at the airport. I don't know what just happened to me, but I'm uncomfortable because I don't know what that was about. So I haven't used ArriveCAN, but through those two experiences, I started to look into it. And it was pretty wild for me because I don't have a law background. And so emergency measures, for example, I don't know about emergency measures, but I dug a bit further and I found the Quarantine Act. I don't know how many people are familiar with the Quarantine Act. The Quarantine Act was the legal document that the government of Canada was pointing at to say, we need to collect this information from you when you're at the airport. So we're going to make this technology mandatory. What I knew without any legal background is there's no way the Quarantine Act said that they had to use technology to do that, or that it had to be an app. So right away I was thinking, like, this is really interesting because the majority of us don't know about the Quarantine Act. We don't know about orders in council. We don't even know how to understand how this decision was made, which from a public advocacy perspective, for me, it's really uncomfortable because what you see is a whole bunch of people just doing what they're told without any clear communication from the government of Canada in terms of what this app was actually doing for our public health response. We were told we had to because of the pandemic. What we were not being told is, what is this doing to keep us safe? And as you'll note throughout the course of the ArriveCAN news coverage, that wasn't really something that ever got discussed. And so I think this brings us back into this history of like, okay, we just need reasons to start to implement some of this technology. So interestingly for me, the crux of my concern was, why did this have to be mandatory? It could have been an optional piece of technology where if you like it and you're comfortable, fine. And if you're not, here's a form. Use the form. And I know for a lot of people I talked to, they would have been a lot more comfortable using the form. What we have to remember here is the form and the app, it's unknown to us whether they feed into the same system or not. But even if you fill something in with your pen and paper, it's going into a database. So it's not like we can evade how these systems talk and interact with each other. But that was the crux of it for me, is why does this have to be mandatory? And the only other time I've run into someone telling me that I had to use an app was at the Canada Post counter in a Shoppers Drug Mart. What these two things have in common is the border. So this again brings back to support this idea of, this conversation about the border. There's something really fundamental about understanding that the way the government might be thinking about moving packages is very much the same as it's thinking about moving people. And I learned through this, the Canada Border Services Agency is the second largest law enforcement agency in Canada. And when you start to read into them, they are concerned with the movement of goods as much as they are in some cases with people. I would just say again, from a public education perspective, I'm not well read into the CBSA in the same way that I feel I understand the police, but they are police fundamentally. So those were some interesting elements of this as I was sort of learning, new to looking at border technology and the legal piece of it. And a few sort of downstream things that happened that I think were interesting. One learning from COVID alert, which is the same with ArriveCAN, is in the federal government, there was significant deference to the Public Health Agency of Canada. So again, you hear, oh, there's something to, we are in a pandemic. And at that point, is this actually working becomes less important than let's just try whatever. Let's just try something. It's the optics of how it looks. But it was interesting because this thing shifted over time. It started as a pandemic response, but then really near the end of it, it started to be, well, we're trying to modernize the border. while it was still mandatory. And so much like COVID alert, you have this issue where you have the CBSA and you also have Transport Canada involved, and you have the Public Health Agency of Canada. So if you think about what's happening at the who's accountable and who's saying how this works and what success looks like, so to speak, super unclear. And that was interesting for me because I want the government to have deference to the Public Health Agency of Canada, but I don't look to the Public Health Agency of Canada to make good technology decisions. I would argue that that's not a strength of the Public Health Agency of Canada at the current moment. We can have a conversation about whether it should be. So I think just two more things. One of them is that ArriveCAN, as you who used it know, you could download it through Apple, Google, or a web app. What happened in the last few months of it being when it was mandatory, there was a glitch. And I don't know if you read about this, but people were receiving false, erroneous messages to quarantine. So they were getting notices to say, you need to quarantine, 14 days, 10 days, stay home. The government of Canada did not proactively deal with that error. This had to come out through the media. So Matt Malone did a lot of great work on this, filing access to information requests. He's working in law at Thompson Rivers University. He did amazing work on this. But it was kind of wild because what you realize here, the majority of the apps we use are in a commercial context. You know, like if you think about how we're using them for commercial rationale. In this case, the government of Canada is delivering a public service through two major private infrastructures that it has no control over. Which to me, when you're impacting people's rights, you get into sovereignty and power issues here. Because we're using Google and Apple to deliver public services, and we can't tell them what to do, and we can't fix it when there's things break. So as a technologist, for me, the only way we should be building this stuff is actually through infrastructure that we can control and direct. So the web, the internet, and there is a third option, is available. So it's not to say you don't ever do anything, but I think it's a big mistake to be building public service delivery through private infrastructures. And we saw one of the consequences of that with this, which is fascinating. I think the last thing I'll say, which David touched on, was it was really interesting to me when people started to push back against this. I turned around and it was the True North trucker convoy, far right. Those were the people who were vocally opposed, for the most part, to ArriveCAN. And I think that was interesting because I think there was some discomfort within what I don't know what to call it, moderate, liberal, moderate, whatever. As soon as that became the point, that that's where the resistance was coming from, a lot of other people went very quiet. And I think that's something we need to talk about because it's a problem. And within, just because you mentioned conspiracy, one of the things someone started to come up to me is to say, oh, the government's experimenting with blockchain credentials at the airport. And I'm like, no, they're not. And then I start to look and I'm like, of course they are. Of course, there's a World Economic Forum, blockchain, Canada, Holland trial going on. And I was like, see this, here we are. So I'll end on that note because I think that it scared me how the issues that came up once this was finally shut down was how much it cost, or there's sort of basic, like, how do we get pissed off about this? We're going to get pissed off about who is contracted and for how much money, or how did we waste this much money? The app's bad. But I think when we think about consent, public service delivery, people being able to have options for public service that they're comfortable with, I think we need to have redundancy in all of our systems. I don't think mandatory technology is something we should ever do unless you're bringing an ironclad rationale. Public Health Agency of Canada did not have an ironclad rationale here. And you saw it because they shifted it into border modernization, which I think is really bad. So I'll stop there and thank you for the setup because I think a lot of the pieces go on and curious to see how you will take this from here, but thank you.
Thanks for having me here today. I came from Ireland. I did not have to use the ArriveCAN app this time around, but I did have to use it during the pandemic a few times because I was a postdoc here at the University of Ottawa right before moving to Ireland for my job when the pandemic hit. So at the point when I had to travel back and tidy my affairs the app was mandatory. And you can imagine, as a surveillance studies scholar, having to use that app was incredibly uncomfortable for me. But it was mandatory, so I had to use it. My one little mode of resistance was using the website rather than downloading the app. I was like, there's no way they're tracking me on my mobile device, right? But yeah, it was a mandatory app. And I think what's really important to think about, and David set this up really well, is how this app was introduced as just another mode of governance by risk. It was an excuse. The pandemic was an excuse to bring in the technology. So it wasn't exceptional. So we talk about the pandemic as being exceptional, but the introduction of this technology wasn't exceptional. And really, it highlights the role of digital technologies in evolving and helping build this diffuse type of border that we're seeing increasingly. And so what I wanted to talk about is maybe some of the trends that we've seen in these surveillance measures, and I will reference the app specifically. So I wanted to kind of look at ArriveCAN more specifically, but look at maybe 5 trends or considerations that we need to engage with when we're looking at the introduction of these new technologies in response to a crisis, and how these things really meaningfully impact people's rights and freedoms. Bianca and David have already highlighted the ways in which the app is just another iteration of an existing technology. So whether it's September 11th or it's a pandemic, these existing systems are appropriated into use for the border. And there's no real conversation around it, because when these technologies are introduced in a time of crisis, it's exceptional. And when it's exceptional, there's no room for dialogue or debate around the technology. And that's, I think, a huge concern for all of us. If we're in a democratic nation, if we all should be having a say in how our rights and freedoms are looked after, then there needs to be more debate around the introduction of these technologies. So in terms of the trends that I wanted to look at, technology acceleration and solutionism, how this has really resulted in a faster integration of these technologies, how function creep opens up and normalizes the use of new technologies, the importance, of course, of kind of societal concerns around privacy or data protection, social justice, certainly, right? And then really, I'll start off with this normalization of exceptionalism. So all over the world, states responded to COVID-19 by invoking this state of emergency. The expansion of this state power allowed it to perform actions and adopt exceptional measures that it wouldn't be able to carry out in normal times. States of emergency allow the adoption of extraordinary political, financial, and administrative resources, as well as authorizing new security practices. And the widespread use of states of emergency creates these conditions that lead to the normalization of exceptionalism once the emergency is over. And I mean, that's why we had the idea for the panel, because this idea of ArriveCAN being used for border management rather than just as a response to the pandemic was what was supposed to happen. The system was supposed to stay on. And in fact, it is still being used. And on my flight over here on the weekend, they announce it before you get off the plane saying, please fill out the ArriveCAN app. Thank you very much. Now, they don't say you have to, and they did say that when you were traveling and it was mandatory, but they still announce it on every flight I've taken since it was stopped. So that's 2 flights. And the girls that were sitting beside me on the plane were very confused, and one of them didn't have any data, and she was wondering, well, how do I fill this out? And I said, sorry to interrupt, just to let you know, you don't need to use the app. You can just go through the airport as normal and use the kiosk and everything will be fine. And they were like, oh, really? Are you sure? And I said, yeah, I study this stuff. I definitely wouldn't fill it out. Oh, thanks so much. It's a very stressful process. And I know Bianca's talked about that, right? So when people had this idea of having to use the app, it did take a lot of time. It was all part of your travel prep. But even though it's not mandatory anymore, there is a push for it. And so that's concerning. And I think that's why it's important that we're still talking about it. Another trend that this represents is the re-entrenchment of the border and a diffuse border and the role that technologies play in it. So in the context of heightened surveillance, most states immediately introduced restrictions on movement, right? It was quite quick that states shut down their borders in response to the pandemic. And then border controls and systems became central in their response to it. Now, ArriveCAN didn't launch, I think, until it was November 2020. So it was a few months of the border being locked down and then other forms of monitoring and tracking when people arrived before ArriveCAN was mandatory. But really, this highlights how, as with migration, border closures relating to COVID-19 reinforce this idea that the threat is external, that it's foreign, that it necessitates a heightened border security apparatus. We want to protect people inside against the external kind of concerns and ills of the world. And I think this was really important to recognize with COVID-19. And we certainly see it again now with certain restrictions being reintroduced for China, for example. Epidemiologists have said that, doesn't seem to be the right approach. It won't be very useful, but it's happening anyway. So there's this kind of idea of being seen to perform security. Again, something that Bianca mentioned. So this type of performance theater. The next trend certainly is this technological acceleration and solutionism. Why did we need to have an app? Why did the existing forms or kiosks that existed at the airports that we already use for, international travel, why did those not suffice? Well, it seems like it was just an excuse for the government to bring in this technology that they were already developing. And so I know Bianca in her work had found that they had developed this app in another version, more or less the same thing that they were going to trial. And then, the pandemic provided the perfect testing ground for that to be introduced. So things were introduced at a heightened rate. And again, because it's under a state of emergency, there's not much room for dialogue around it. The last thing that I wanted to kind of talk about was this idea of function creep. And I know the idea for this panel came when David and I were engaging on Twitter about, is this function creep? Is this something else? What is it? So for those of you who aren't familiar, function creep is the process whereby a technology or a practice is introduced for one express purpose and is then taken up and used for other purposes. So the technology is taken up beyond its original purposes, let's say, usually once it's become normalized. Now, I would say in the case of the ArriveCAN app, we see it being switched from this experimental ground into the use for the pandemic with ArriveCAN. And then there was another attempt to reappropriate it, but that, fell through ultimately, as we saw with the decision to, drop the system in October. So let me just conclude here. I think some key questions we need to ask when these systems are being introduced are things like, how will the public react to the widespread use of this technology? I mean, Bianca makes the interesting point about, certain groups with political affiliations, one way or the other, wanting to talk about the technology and how that may or may not dissuade others. I would say this is great when you see the likes of the Office of the Privacy Commissioner engaging in these areas. They provide that kind of neutral ground and lens to analyze these tech at arm's length from the government. Could this type of technology trigger, a growing societal acceptance for, a more pervasive monitoring in our lives? I think the reaction to ArriveCAN certainly wasn't positive. Certainly for the, COVID-19 tracing app as well, it wasn't positive. And I think, these questions will begin to be answered in the next months and years as our perception of this emergency kind of vanishes. But the digital footprint that it leaves on society or on the potential new technologies or practices that government might want to introduce, it will play out in terms of our reaction. And I think that's really important for us to see. And of course, civil liberties, human rights, social justice concerns need to be at the center of all of these debates anytime we're talking about introducing a new policing or surveillance measure. We know the border operates as a state of exception, and we need to kind of challenge that as much as we can. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I'm going to kick us off with a little bit of a provocation, which is this. It seems to me that borders have never been nice places, especially if you look like me. Tends to be an unpleasant experience at the best of times. So I'm wondering, maybe Dave, I can start with you. I've been to Heathrow recently. I got COVID after I went there, different story. But, on the one hand, there's a creepiness to the automation. On the other hand, there isn't some border guy looking me over and saying, I don't like the cut of your jib. So, let's take you to secondary, right? In some way, the technology, the best argument is that it's more fair, it's more neutral, it's more dispassionate, right? Do you think that's true? Is it a question of the implementation of the technologies and their purpose, or is it that we actually do need sort of, there's something better about the previous approach of the border as, you said, it's a line, rather than a zone, clear demarcation and with a human element to it?
Well, I mean, they work better in terms of like what they're intended to do. That's the question, right? They're efficient, and that's exactly what they're supposed to be. The question is, who is being allowed to be whose passage is allowed to be smoother? Who is allowed to be efficient in this sense? I mean, all of us, despite whether we're white or otherwise, we're all members of an elite. Basically, we're pre-cleared, pre-checked. We pass all the tests. So, while we may superficially, resemble in some cases the asylum seeker or the refugee, that isn't us. And I think we've got to think about the border is that the border is everywhere, but the other side of the border being everywhere is every one of us carries our own personal border with us. And we never escape that in many ways. So for somebody who isn't, pre-cleared, the right kind of person and everything else, even if they do pass through the border, they never really truly come in. They're surrounded by, you can imagine it's like a giant elastic band around them all the time. Anything that they do that is not right, anything they do that is problematic, they are cast out again. The elastic band just flings them out. That can even be true for permanent residents in Canada. Doesn't matter what your status is if you're still surrounded by that personal border, So I think we have to realize that there are different kinds of differentiations made here, and there are different kinds of borders for different kinds of people, and different kinds of border experiences for different kinds of people, and we can all be one of those kinds of people at different times too. It's not always the same for everyone all the time.
So my take on this is, and this is to talk more than ArriveCAN in all of the systems, to have redundancy. So the question is not, is it this or that? It's always pluralist. You can do which one you're comfortable with. And that investment is where the federal government would push back and say, no, we're saving money with these systems. And that's why, and if you look at the unionized, CBSA is unionized, they weren't into this app. Their job turned into tech support at the border. And I know, like, this is, again, when you get into policing conversations, for me, one of the reasons that I like to retain the labor component of this is always when I go into like the dark side in terms of where all of these systems can go, labor and people always represent friction possibilities. It is always a choice. Like when the person can make a decision outside of that system, that's good for me. When it's a police force, okay, we're not starting from the best version of putting labor in between people and systems. But yeah, like I think that's the direction I go with that. And that's why I think legally it would be really interesting to understand. It's almost like an accessibility argument. Can we force redundancy through every digital system? And that would increase adoption, I'm pretty sure, versus trying to make things, I mean, not when they're mandatory, but that's the track I'm on with.
So I think that's a sort of larger point about digitization of public services that we saw with the pandemic, and about 3 kids who were educated on Google Classroom for much longer than my sanity allowed, right, as another example of this. Ciara, did you want to come in on this?
The technical difficulties. I mean, this is something that I always speak to my students about is, this idea that technology is always perfect. And indeed, it's not. It rarely is. And then the problem is when the technology fails, it looks like there's something wrong with the individual. So this is one of the things that scares me most about the use of technology in the airports, is that when something doesn't work, like when your fingerprints don't read properly, you look suspicious. It's not that the technology isn't working. How could it possibly be that? So, I mean, on the one hand, I think certainly for individuals who would be targeted in the airport space because of their identity characteristics, not having to engage with border security personnel could be a little bit more comfortable. But, the systems are still doing those things. I mean, we have to feed them so much information that they're profiling us, they're targeting us in different ways already. So it might feel better. And I think, we shouldn't say that that doesn't count at all. But then, it's still happening behind the scenes. So yeah, I don't know if it makes it any better. It certainly sanitizes it all, right? It makes it easier for the border to sort people, and so that the privileged people maybe don't have to see the other stuff that's going on either. God forbid you make those who flow through easily see how bad it can be for other individuals, That's something that strikes me now in Pearson. There's a very weird streaming of people. I only notice this kind of more recently. And, if you're Canadian, if you have a visa, if that all seems to check out, you're funneled right through in one direction. And then anything else around kind of migration, immigration, I mean, the way you're pushed into a particular area and held, I mean, it seems very hostile, So yeah, I don't think the technology helps. I guess that's the short answer.
Great. All right. Do we have any questions from the room or online? I believe there's a way for online. No, there isn't. Okay. Sorry. Again, technology. There you go. Oh, no questions online yet, but please, if you have a question or want to jump in, please do that. Yes.
While you're thinking about it, I just want to come back on something that Bianca was saying about labor. Some of you may be skeptical about this idea that the labor potential of CBSA workers or the police is somewhere we should look. But one thing to bear in mind is that it's almost an iron law of surveillance technology that the people conducting the surveillance are themselves inevitably and eventually subject to very intense forms of surveillance themselves and learn that way. So, when the police introduced, body cams were introduced, for example, a lot of police objected to this because they thought it was about monitoring them before they learned how to use these to their own advantage, of course. But that kind of moment when there's a kind of realization that the technology isn't their friend, actually, after all, can be one, I think there's a potential intervention there, even if you're somebody who's skeptical of the the idea of the police or the CBSA workers as laborers.
Yeah, and okay, yes, I'll repeat your question.
Clarifying question. You mentioned that ArriveCAN or something like it was in development before. Can you just expand on that? What you found out? What the
Yeah.
story is on that?
So the question is that I had found out that there was a sort of trial of ArriveCAN in the works before it was launched, and what the background of that is. So that's the question. There was an app that was custom. It's like it was a custom declarations form, fundamentally, that was independent and prior to ArriveCAN, and it was voluntary. It did not have big uptake. So CBSA wanted us to be doing what they eventually introduced into ArriveCAN, which is your customs declaration. That was like an optional piece, even when it was still mandatory. So they basically took something that was failing before independently, and then they launched it as ArriveCAN and got people trained on a system that they could not get people to adopt independently prior. And that it was a hell of a way to do it. So that's the background on that. Obviously, I have feelings about it.
So we have an online question, and then come to you right after that, if that's okay. The online question is about what the privacy implications are of ArriveCAN. Maybe we can put a spin on that and say, what are the implications of collection of that data through an app, as opposed to what else would happen, if you're sort of presenting the same information at the port of entry?
Yeah. Thanks. I did abbreviate what I was saying earlier, but if I'd gone into all of the text, I would have talked a little bit more about this. But, the idea that you're putting this sensitive data, so health data, into an online database should be concerning to anyone, right? We know with all of these technologies that breaches are possible. So when you have a system like that, that is collecting vast amounts of sensitive information about various travelers, I think there's always cause for concern. Now, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner did look over the system and said, yeah, it's proportionate. Things look okay. We're happy with it. Under the state of emergency, it was allowed. But certainly the collection of this information, I think, at any point is concerning, especially if it's kind of enabled through a mobile app. Again, I know in some of the great work that Bianca has done, she talked about how you couldn't really see the inner workings of the system either. So to an extent, it was black boxed. So you don't get to see how the system is actually operating. Again, I think that's another concern, especially when it's sensitive information that you're putting into these systems. Pass it over to David. Thank you.
Yeah, just one thing we need to make absolutely clear here, and there's been some confusion about this because it's an app, is people tend to think sometimes it functioned like the COVID notification apps, right? It was a similar sort of thing, but it wasn't. I mean, there's a very, very clear distinction, although Apple and Google were both involved, and that's a thing we really, really should talk about a lot more about why that was. The COVID notification apps, I'm not, by the way, calling them tracing apps, contact tracing apps, because they weren't. They were notification apps, and they never did any contact tracing. But the data on those things was stored on device, and nothing was actually kept centrally, right? Basically, some question. But with this app, it's completely different, right? It is a centralized collection system. Data is being collected centrally, so there is no comparison. So one thing just to bear in mind is these are not similar kinds of apps just because they're apps. But some of you may have some differences about this. Anyway, Bianca.
Yeah, and just quickly, I want to say that to something David mentioned earlier about privacy being downstream of general justice issues and equity issues. The privacy, when you look at things in a privacy frame, as Ciara was saying, the privacy commissioner looked at this, even though all the privacy commissioners said, all the provincial, territorial, and federal said, don't make health apps mandatory in the pandemic. They all signed a statement. Feds did it anyway. And then the privacy commissioner just is sort of like, okay, well, let's see how it's working. We have no regime that's going to say, don't do this. And that for me is a problem, is that privacy is downstream of the should we be doing this at all conversation, and it's limiting in some ways. So I think that's a cause for concern when the real questions are, is this a thing that should, that we should have?
So we have about 10 minutes left. So I thought we could collect questions in the room and then see if we have time to get to our online question as well. Would you like to go ahead?
How do you balance that against the government's demonstrated inability to create their own technology that functions properly? Witness the Phoenix pay system, and there's like people in this city that are still screwed and haven't been paid in years. So how do we rely on to balance that?
I've got it.
In-house inequity. And
Oh, you want to answer that quickly, and then we'll grab the other two?
Yeah, this is, firstly, the governments aren't even using 1990s technology well. And if we were to just invest seriously in the infrastructure, in labor, in the public service to support services that are digital, we would do it. We'd be fine. We need to pay people well. We need to take it seriously, but we could do it. But right now there's no political incentive to make those investments, and everything's contracted out. It's all it's the consulting firms. And the number one thing, I said I'd be quick. The reason the government outsources all of this is not because they can't do it. It's because they outsource the liability to the company. So when there's a problem, it's not them. And we as a country have to get past that if we want to do something differently. And we have to allow failure. Tech always breaks. It does.
Okay, maybe the lady in the back, if we can get your question, and the gentleman in the middle here. Okay, so the question is about ArriveCAN data being used beyond a border context. Can we get your question too, and then we'll deal.
Just moving on to you. I mean, there's concern about the sensitive data. You do that all the time. So why is it here? Why is it a concern here? Why very sensitive about your insurance company? With healthcare providers collecting money for health with mind. Many of the clinical classes being done or decentralized classes that collected online. Patients could become friends. So why is this a problem here compared to all the other situations where it's
all right, so in a nutshell, what's the problem with sensitive data collection, especially health information collection, in the ArriveCAN and border context, as opposed to all the other places that we do that? Who would like to jump in on either of the questions?
On the first one, just because I was deep into the clause, was ArriveCAN data used in another case? There was a clause, and this of course got picked up by the far right, which basically said, if law enforcement wants to, they can. And I don't think we would know if that happened, but they could. They could use it if there was rationale, but it would have to come from trying to get people under the Quarantine Act. That's as much as I know. I don't know of it happening, but it was completely possible.
And I guess that's also a kind of an answer to the second question in a way, because most of our health data that we provide online or otherwise, we don't expect to end up with the police or with the American intelligence services or anything else like that, right? So if there's an extra element of risk in this, it's that. I think, but then we shouldn't be complacent about the risks to begin with, right? I mean, just because lots of stuff happens online already, it doesn't mean it's working well and everything's fine, right? The amount of data leakage from existing health information is enormous. I mean, like every other source of data, we have very good health privacy laws in Canada compared to some places, which protect us to some extent, but they still don't stop fat-fingered, people accidentally sending data to the wrong people, or data leakage or hacking, or people holding whole hospitals to ransom, as we've seen recently. There's lots of things that can go wrong. So I think we have to be careful in the first place, just to say, just because it happens at the moment, not all is well. And we still need to be very careful. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but we need to be very, very careful. We need to safeguard our privacy, we're quite aggressively, I think, more aggressively than we do.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I'd echo, what David says, but in the case where you're uploading your health information for insurance, it's not mandatory necessarily. So in many cases, you can opt out. You can choose a different way. Like David's saying, I mean, we should never be complacent with this. I mean, some of the biggest breaches, that come to my mind right away are around, there was an Ottawa hospital leak where I think a nurse shared information about new moms with a private company that, I don't know, was baby formula or something like that to target marketing. Life Labs had a massive breach in the past year or so. And so, it's increasingly becoming a target as we use these online services. So like David said, we do have some safeguards in place with the acts around, privacy and healthcare, but it is something that we should always kind of be challenging. I think, as informed citizens, questioning why we're using that particular technology is never a bad thing. It's never a bad thing.
Okay, we're almost out of time, but I have a couple of online questions I'm just going to put out there. So one's a clarification about whether any medical information other than vaccination status was ever collected by these apps. But the other, I think, is a really interesting question to end on, which is, how could we communicate to the public and get a debate going around some of these questions around technological solutionism, function creep, et cetera? So what do we do to sort of land this right when the next crisis happens and there's a rush to similar kinds of tools?
Yeah. So what I found successful was letting people know that, like, I'm a technologist and I don't use this thing and I don't like it. And you're not against the future if you don't want to use these things, or you're not anti-innovation if you don't think this is the way the public services should be delivered. I found that incredibly powerful because people feel scared. They feel like, I don't want to look stupid. I don't want to look like I'm scared. I can't use my phone properly. It's incredible how much of that is a lock-in. And then people don't want to talk. And it's like, ooh. And then, so I think us being open from a technological advancement perspective to say, like, these things are optional. We have to develop public services so everybody's comfortable. And then you make space, at least for it to be okay to not like it or not want it. Not necessarily for privacy reasons, just because you don't like it. You don't understand what's going on. Like, that's completely valid. That's a piece.
I think the other thing related to that very much is that in terms of people not wanting to seem anti-technological, is that, we're not saying that all technology is bad here, but also it's there are many other technologically enabled solutions that could actually protect your privacy much better, right? I mean, I'm not an advocate of privacy by design particularly, but there are many different kinds of ways in which technology can be used to enhance privacy and human rights. And it doesn't mean that privacy has to be a victim of technology. So I think that's another thing to think about, is that if your technology is potentially damaging these things, maybe it's the wrong technology. Maybe a different one might be better. You don't have to abandon all technology. I mean, I have a very nice carbon fiber bike. That's very, very high tech. But some people look at me and think a cyclist is somehow less technologically advanced than somebody driving a car. It's a weird attitude, right? They're just two different technologies. And we need to think about things that way as well.
Since we're almost at time, Ciara, I'm going to give you the last word.
I mean, I think it's a great question, and it's something, like, these are trends that we see across all of these different technologies, across surveillance generally, and it's something that I try to bring up in my work. So one thing that I've been doing recently with a project that I'm part of in Ireland is we do think-ins. So we run an event. It's about an hour and a half, 2 hours long, in an evening or on the weekend. And we go to different towns, different neighborhoods in the city, and we share scenarios with people. We share a short little story that gets them coming to terms with a new technology, with a new kind of security challenge. And then we have chats around a table. And we kind of inform them about what's going on. They ask their questions, they answer questions. And it is a way of public engagement that I think is really meaningful. For me, I'm seeing a prospect in using it as a research tool, but it's also very informative, I think, for the public. The most important thing, I think, for all of us is that we're always engaging in this debate. You know, as an academic, I don't want to just teach in a classroom. I want my work to have an impact outside the classroom as well. And so if we can be in public fora discussing these things, I think that's a key, hopefully, to change. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad I gave you the last word, because you ended us on an optimistic and positive note. So I would like to thank all three of you. I learned so much from each of you and from this discussion. I thought it was really rich. So please join me in giving them a big hand, please.